So the Beyond Gas Network is a volunteer network of grassroots climate action networks that began in Melbourne and now has established links to groups and organisations in other parts of Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, the Northern Territory and Western Australia. Through our groups, our email list reaches tens of thousands of people, just like you and us, you and me, and people who are just really keen to protect our environment and to stop, climate change from getting to unbearable levels. So now I would like to introduce Carmel, and she will give a bit of a presentation. And Carmel is one of the national coordinators of Lock the Gate, and she will give will walk us through some of the big issues and then we'll go on to some of the actions we can take. So Carmel, over to you.
Thanks, Helen. Really appreciate that. Hi, everyone. I'm lucky to be dialing in from Bundjalung country in northern New South Wales, and really glad to see you all here to learn more about the water trigger and get fired up about it. So I'm going to share a little presentation, which hopefully will work for everyone. Can you guys see that now?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Excellent. So I'm just going to run through what the risks are of shale and tight gas with a focus on the Northern Territory and the Kimberley in WA, what the water trigger is currently in federal environment law and how it's been applied by the Federal Environment Minister, and then on to sort of why it's urgent that we get this up and running now for shale and tight gas, and how we can all get involved to make that happen. So to kick off, for those who don't know, shale and tight gas are two forms of unconventional gas. Unconventional gas is gas that requires what are described as unconventional methods to extract, which include methods like hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling. Hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, as most of you know, involves sort of pushing under high pressure water, chemicals and sand deep under the ground to crack the seams that hold these gases to enable the gases to be mobilized and then extracted. So in the case of shale gas, those gases are held in shale seams, but in the case of tight gas, they're usually held in sandstone rocks. And the difference from conventional gas is that conventional gas generally is held in reservoirs of gas, which generally only require a couple of gas wells to reach those, and for that gas to come out without a lot of extra pressure and effort required. But with these shale and tight gas, requires much more effort, and as a result, it's held sort of in rocks across the landscape, and generally requires a lot of gas wells stretched out across the landscape. So often end up with thousands of gas wells, with lots of roads and connecting pipelines, and all sorts of associated infrastructure, which means that unconventional gas has a footprint that's really unlike any other new industry we've had in Australia for the last 50 years or so, I'd say. To give an example, one of the coal seam gas proposals in Queensland that was approved in 2010 stretched across 1 million hectares, and is proposed to have 10,000 gas wells, a lot of which have now been drilled. So the third form of unconventional gas is coal seam gas. But the two we're talking about tonight are shale and tight gas. So the threats to water from shale and tight gas include really high levels of water demand to conduct fracking. They're often very deep wells. They're often very long wells horizontally under the ground as well. So it requires a lot of water. And up in the Territory, one of the gas wells recently reported using 100 megalitres of water per well. So that's 100 million litres of water per well, which requires huge amounts of water to be extracted to sort of meet that demand. There's a risk of contamination of aquifers, either through the chemicals that are used in fracking escaping into aquifers, or from cross-contamination from deeper aquifers that are often quite salty and have high levels of chemicals and petrochemicals. and often radioactive materials as well. Basically creating a connection between that and the more shallow aquifers that humans rely on, and contaminating aquifers that way. Also depressurization of aquifers, so the extraction of water in the process of producing gas can lead to the aquifers losing water, and then that can again be linked to more shallow aquifers and leading to depressurization of beneficial aquifers. And then all of this leads to the production of quite a lot of waste materials, and often with these really deep sources of water that have been there for a very long time, you often have sort of naturally occurring radioactive elements. You often have high levels of salts and sort of hydrocarbons, so often have quite a toxic mix. And then you have all the waste from the fracking process and the chemicals used as well. And so there's just a heap of waste. The gas industry in Queensland, for example, with coal seam gas, they've got a heap of that they're still just storing in ponds because they haven't found a solution to it, despite them having been at this for 10 years. They're also releasing waste into rivers. A lot of it they treat with reverse osmosis and then release into rivers, but they have also sought to release untreated wastewater into rivers. So it's a big problem, the amount of waste, the fact that they often get approvals before they've worked out what they're doing with this waste, which represents a particularly big threat in Northern Australia, where we have a wet season that, you know, can lead to just immense downpours of water. And at the moment, that waste with exploratory fracking in the Northern Territory is being held in open ponds. So if this waste is held in open ponds, it represents a major risk to surface water. There's been a recent incident in the Territory where a gas company was found to have used drilling waste and sprayed it around a gas site because it didn't want to fall foul of its sort of levels that it had to keep its waste dams at, and it was the wet season was coming, so it actually sprayed waste around on a site. And that's the kind of things that happen in this situation, which can lead to a lot of issues in relation to water. This is a map of the all the petroleum titles currently in the Northern Territory. So the orange are petroleum exploration applications, and the red are petroleum exploration titles that have been granted. And you can see that a lot of the area that's been granted is what's called the Beetaloo Basin, sort of from Elliot out to Borroloola and up to Nooka, that heart of the Territory there. As you can see, the scale of the threat to the Territory is immense. And the scale of the ambitions of the gas industry are really immense. And as the industry shifts from its currently in an exploration phase to production, the scale combined with the kind of impacts that unconventional gas has represents just an enormous risk to the water resources of the Northern Territory. Some of the sort of water resources at risk in the Territory are the Roper River, the recharge for some of the hot springs like Mataranka and Bitter Springs, and then places like this is Lake Woods, Chakaya, which is down at the bottom of the Newcastle Creek system, incredibly significant inland water hole with incredible significance for bird life and other values. So there's a huge amount of significant water resources that are under threat. Similarly, in the Kimberley, this is a map of the Kimberley, and the titles there are the pastel coloured, the petroleum exploration titles. As you can see, a lot of the West Kimberley is basically covered in titles currently. There's this area here, the Dampier Peninsula, is actually excluded from fracking, but all these other leases are petroleum titles currently. So again, massive scale of the threat combined with the impacts is very significant. And as you can see there, the Fitzroy River passes through a lot of that. The titles go down close to Broome, down on the Roebuck Plains down here. So there's some of the sort of key places that risk are the sort of Fitzroy River floodplain, Fitzroy River catchment, and Roebuck Plains in the Kimberley. Some of the kind of water dependent environments that are really at threat. Traditional owners have raised a lot of concerns about this threat to water and the impacts of fracking to climate and to water. These are some statements from Jocelyn James, a Mungarai traditional owner from Jilkmingen in the NT near the Beetaloo Basin, really highlighting just the long-term impacts to water, to climate, and what that will mean for country and for culture to traditional owners. Similarly, Ray Dimacari-Dixon, who's a Woodborough traditional owner from Marlinger in the NT near Elliot, has also raised these issues repeatedly about the impacts of fracking on water in particular, and that if water is lost and contaminated in this country, then traditional owners don't have anywhere else to go. It's crucial to culture. So that sort of underscores not only the ecological value, but then the outstanding cultural significance of water and just how important it is to maintain those water sources. So the water trigger, it's basically a provision that was inserted in the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act in 2013. It was an amendment to the Act, and it applies to large coal and coal seam gas projects only. So large coal and coal seam gas projects that are likely to have a significant impact on water resources are caught by the trigger. They have to be referred to the Federal Environment Minister. Then they have to go through an assessment process in accordance with some federal guidelines, and then the Federal Environment Minister needs to make a decision on those projects. So the benefits of that are that it does produce a more rigorous assessment of impacts than we tend to get from state governments and state processes. That's particularly because of the independent review process. The federal government has an independent expert scientific committee that has standing under the Act, and it's a panel of national water experts who have really do an incredible job of reviewing individual project proposals and identifying the water risks, and also reviewing the water modelling and the water data that companies are putting up. So they provide this incredibly detailed and really credible advice to the minister when the minister makes a decision. And then ultimately the Federal Environment Minister, by virtue of this trigger, becomes a decision maker. Federal Environment Minister for all decisions that have been referred under the water trigger then needs to make a decision to approve or reject the project. So brings in the Federal Environment Minister, gives you another level of decision making above the state governments, gives you independent review, and gives you a more rigorous assessment of impacts. So it is very significant. It does have its weaknesses, and one of those in particular is that it doesn't require proper consideration of Indigenous cultural knowledge and significance. The water guidelines, the significant impact guidelines for water don't require sufficient consideration of Indigenous knowledge and interest in water, and that is a flaw, and that's something that we'll come to later that we think also needs to be addressed, as well as extending this trigger. The history of the water trigger is interesting. Whilst a lot of projects that have been referred to the Federal Minister under the water trigger have been approved, that's coal and coal seam gas projects, particularly in the last 1 to 2 years, the independent panel has been giving incredibly strong advice, and it's led to some really significant outcomes. So in particular, they advise strongly against the Dendrobium coal expansion in Sydney's drinking water catchment, similarly against the Central Queensland coal mine near the Barrier Reef. Both those projects have not proceeded, in large part, in our view, due to that work by the Independent Expert Scientific Committee. And they also advised very strongly against the discharge of untreated coal seam gas wastewater into the Dawson River in Queensland, and Santos have since dropped that proposal. They're still planning to discharge treated water, but they're not proposing to discharge raw wastewater into the Dawson River, thank goodness. So yeah, I think they're 3 good examples of how the water trigger can be really great, and can lead to these projects being knocked back, these types of big resource projects. Another example is that the Australian Conservation Foundation led a successful legal challenge against Adani's water pipeline. Their plan to bring water from further north from the Sutter River down to the Adani Carmichael coal mine. They didn't refer that to the federal government under the water trigger, and ACF was able to succeed in a challenge saying they should have referred that, because even infrastructure associated with a mine that relates to water should also be caught by the trigger. So that led to the definition and how the trigger is applied being expanded somewhat to also capture associated infrastructure. So that's quite significant as well. So they're the real positives and a bit of the history of the water trigger today. So shale gas and tight gas aren't covered by the current water trigger, and that's predominantly because at the time in 2013, it was really when Tony Windsor was in the balance of power, and he was working hard to make sure the water impacts of coal and coal seam gas were considered, and he worked with the Labor government to get those amendments made. But shale and tight gas hadn't really started off. It wasn't really a big threat at the time, so it wasn't well understood that it would become an issue, so it wasn't covered. But since then, there's been a lot of work, a lot of consideration as to whether shale and tight gas should be included, and projects that include shale or tight gas should have to consider their water impacts. So most notably, the federal Labor government made a pre-election promise in the lead up to the 2022 election in May last year, committing to implement extending the water trigger to those projects. It was also recommended by the NT fracking inquiry in 2018. So there's been a lot of pressure. There was also the Beetaloo Senate inquiry, which was brought out earlier this year, I think in April, which also recommended that fracking should be extended to shale and tight gas. That was a federal Senate committee with Labor people on it. So there's been sort of 3 really strong recommendations that this needs to happen now, and it's actually getting quite late, because right now 2 of the gas companies in particular in the Territory, Tamboran and Empire, are seeking production approvals in the NT. They are in a position, because of the NT government's laws, to get production approvals within exploration licenses. So they don't need to get production approvals. They can switch their existing exploration and appraisal wells across to production. So potentially that can happen quite quickly. And we can expect to see no further water assessment than those they've already done, which have been quite inadequate. So if we don't get this water trigger in place to capture those projects as they move to production, there's going to be no proper independent review. There's going to be no decision by a federal environment minister. So these projects can start production and there won't have been a decision by a federal environment minister as to whether they should or should not proceed, which is a big problem. The government has some larger reforms to national environmental laws, to the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act on foot currently, but they are delayed and they look like they won't pass the Parliament potentially till much later next year. They still haven't been introduced. They're very complex. There's a lot of issues that they cover. So the big risk is that if this water trigger extension is wrapped up with those, then gas production will get approved and it won't have been caught by the water trigger. So that's the big risk, and that's why we're really seeking to push now to get this extension happening straight away. So we want to see just a standalone amendment to the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act that extends the water trigger to shale gas and tight gas, just exactly in line with Labor's commitments. It's a very short and simple amendment, just some small word changes plus some definitional and transitional provisions. And then once that is in place, we really want to see those significant impact guidelines amended to also require consideration of cultural knowledge and significance of water for traditional owners. So that's what we're aiming to see and we want to see this year. So the actions that are needed now really is we're keen for everyone to reach out to their federal MPs, and Beyond Gas Network have a brilliant briefing note which Peter will talk through shortly. To be aware that many of these MPs might say we've got these EPBC reforms, these national law reforms underway, but to be clear, they're just too far away and there's a very high likelihood that these projects will move to production before that is in force, those broader reforms. And we really want that water trigger extended this year. So that's it from me, I think.